the chat, and I just hit the record button. I'll ask you to put any questions you have during the presentation in the chat, and then at the end we'll be keeping track of the questions. We'll go through all the questions, and you can put more questions in the chat. We'll get to all the questions. And this webinar is being recorded, so we'll have it up on our website, and then we will be doing another one in January. So with that, I will turn it over to Megan.
All right, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. We'll try to run through this fairly quickly, but because we do want to make sure that you understand the program, and for those of you who applied during round one, there are some slight changes to round two, nothing too strenuous though, mostly just to make the process a lot smoother and easier from things that we learned during round one. So we'll try to get through this fairly quickly tonight and then get to the end, and we'll answer all of your questions you have. Again, the purpose of the webinar is really to run through the program, what it is, quickly go through the application itself and kind of walk you through that, give you some tips and pointers and guidance, and then to answer your general questions in the end. You're welcome to put in specific questions into the chat, but if you've got very specific questions about your project, that's something that you want to reach out to me individually for, and we can have a phone call to discuss, or you'll see in the end. We're also accepting requests for site visits if you would like to do that as well. So reach out to me individually if you have really specific questions about your project and your application, and we will get those answered for you as well. All right, so jumping into this, let's see if I can get it to move forward. Okay, so this is the Genesee Valley Rural Revitalization Grant, or we're calling it GIVR, GVRR for short. This is a program that's funded by the Paul Brunn Historic Revitalization Grants Program through the Historic Preservation Fund, which is administered by the National Park Service, which is part of the Department of the Interior. So basically, to give you a quick rundown so you understand where this funding is coming from, this is a federal grant that was passed down to the state of New York. And then Caitlin and I at the Landmark Society are working with the state Historic Preservation Office to administer this program. So it's a federal grant passed down to the state. So this is a state grant program that the Landmark Society is assisting with. The Preservation Fund was established in 1976, and it provides preservation grants and other financial assistance to state tribes, local governments, states, nonprofits, and other partners. And again, it's administered by the National Park Service. And this provides financial assistance for activities that will contribute to planning for the preservation of the built environment and archaeological resources. So this is a preservation-related grant. The purpose of the Genesee Valley Rural Revitalization Grant is to support historic restoration and rehabilitation projects throughout our rural communities in the Finger Lakes and Western New York regions. We want to preserve historic places that have shaped our rural communities, their social fabric, their economy, and the awards will be given in the amount of $5,000 up to a $50,000 max, and these are for capital projects with a caveat that we'll talk about in a little while. The benefits of this program being awarded funding is that you would receive membership to the Landmark Society of Western New York's affiliate program for the duration of the grant project, which is basically where you kind of jump to the front of the line for our help and guidance and projects. And we also get you in touch with other people who've been awarded, other contractors, all that kind of stuff to help you through your project. And then a National Register listed property can take advantage of the state and federal historic tax credit programs and other financial assistance programs. So that's another benefit of the GIVR grant, is that you would then be a National Register list. You'd have to go through National Register listing if you're not already, which we'll talk about later, which kicks open the door for some of these other financial assistance programs. We'll quickly run through eligibility. I know many of you have heard some of this already from round one, but eligible buildings are historic, commercial, industrial, civic, educational, or community-oriented buildings. We found with round one that community-oriented building can mean a number of things. For example, a house of worship could potentially be eligible for this program if there are, if it serves the community in some capacity outside of religious services and programming at the church. So there's some wiggle room with what that community-oriented building could mean. And if you have questions about that, feel free to put it in the chat. We can answer that, or you can reach out to me individually. Buildings need to be located within Allegheny, Cattaraugus, Genesee, Livingston, Ontario, Orleans, Seneca, Schuyler, Steuben, Wayne, Wyoming, and Yates counties. So again, in the Genesee Valley, kind of Finger Lakes region. This one is very important. The building does need to be located within an incorporated village with a population of 4,000 people or less, or within a town with a population of 10,000 or less. I just want to explain that a little more. I know that can be a little confusing. If your building is located within an incorporated village boundary, your building is in the village and has to meet the village population requirement. You would not be considered within the town. If your building is outside of the village or another city limit, you would have to meet the population requirement of 10,000 or less. You wouldn't be able to do the village population. Wouldn't really work that way around anyways, but just so that's very clear, if your building, it counts where your building is located. If you're in the village, you have to use the village population. And then another important aspect is you do need to be listed in or determined eligible for listing in the New York State and National Registers of Historic Places. Buildings that receive funding through this program that are not already listed in the National Register do have to become listed to receive their grant reimbursement. So we will work with you. I'll talk a little more about that later, but should that be the case in a funded project in round 2, we would work with you through that as well. All right, eligible applicants are community-based nonprofit organizations, units of local government, such as your village, town, or county, business owners who operate in a historic building. Either they can be the building owner, or you may not be the owner. You would need permission from the building owner to apply. And then non-residential property owners who own one of the eligible building types. Just to make it very clear, residential homeowners are not eligible for this, and neither are state or federal agencies. Some eligible projects. This is a capital grant program, which means basically things to your building. So such as roof replacement, masonry repair, window repair or replacement, weatherization of your building, meeting ADA accessibility, systems upgrades or installation. And then you can also use this for completion of cultural resource surveys and National Register nominations. And that's where I'll kind of jump in with that National Register portion that I talked about in the last slide. Again, if your building is not already National Register listed and you get funded through this program, you do have to have your building listed in the National Register in order to be reimbursed by the grant. So if you are not National Register eligible already and you can reach out, or not National Register listed already, you can reach out to me for help. I can help you determine whether you are or not. But you would want to include in your application, and we'll talk about this again later as we go through the application, but you want to include some costs to have that nomination completed. Or if you're going to pay for it in a different manner outside of the Giver Grant program, you would need to let us know how that's going to be done, because our grant review panel will have to confirm that you really will move forward with that process if you're funded. Some ineligible projects are things like furnishing spaces, sound systems, site work, so anything outside of the building envelope itself, landscaping, and non-historic structures. And lighting systems, there's an asterisk there just because this kind of depends on what you're doing. If it's something that is going to be permanently attached to the building, that could be considered eligible. If it's something that's a little bit more, that will be removable, is not being installed to be a permanent thing on the building, then it's considered more of a furnishing. And then lastly, you can also use Giver Grant funding for soft costs such as construction documents or conditions assessments, but only 20% of the amount that you're receiving can be used towards those. So you would still have to use some funding towards actual capital building work. So just a little eligibility checklist here. Again, you have to meet the location. The property has to be located in an incorporated village of 4,000 or less, or town of 10,000 or less. Your property has to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places or determined eligible for listing by SHPO, which is the State Historic Preservation Office, SHPO for short. And again, if you're funded, the property does have to be listed in the National Register to receive that grant reimbursement. The grant request would have to be anywhere between $5,000 to $50,000. So $50,000 is the max that will be given out per project. Project completion would need to be done within 2 years of funding the award. And then your project will have to comply with the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. I'll talk a little bit later about what those are, but because this is a preservation program, you do have to make sure that you're meeting preservation requirements. And then of course, if you are funded, you, as part of your grant agreement process with the state, just so that you're aware up front, there would be a preservation covenant placed on your building. You would have to agree to that term in order for the funding to come through. And that is not a set amount of time. It's generally not too long. It usually depends on the amount of money you're awarded or what the project is you're doing. But generally it could be anywhere from 5 to 20, 25 years and would go with the building, not with you as the owner. And that's really just to protect the state and the federal government's investment in your property by receiving the award. But you would receive more information on that if your project is funded. So general grant conditions, I just want to put a caveat out there with this slide, is that additional information on all of these conditions will be provided to people who are awarded the grant during your grant agreement process with the state. So these aren't generally things you have to worry too much about right now. They're just FYI, if you're funded, you need to be aware of these things. So there would be a slight competitive bidding process for consultants or contractors required. In general, that'll just mean that you get about 3 estimates from people and work with the state, show them who they are. It won't be quite as rigorous if you've ever applied for a state grant before. It won't be quite as rigorous as the typical competitive bidding process. Again, you would be required to have a preservation covenant following the completion of the project, and that term is based on the grant amount. And then funded projects would require signage about the grant funding. That is something that will also come from the state. They'll have a template letting you know what needs to be on that sign. And then of course, property owners must pursue a National Register of Historic Places listing if you're not already designated. All right, so now we're going to move into the application and the instructions. And those of you who have reached out for this may have a copy of this. You can follow along. But we're basically going to move right through how the application will work. So the application instructions were made, I know they're a little long, but they're made to help you, the applicant, fill out the application and give us the best application you can. So it is really important that you read through that application and the instructions before you really start working on the form. The round 2 application deadline will be March 31st, 2022. I know that seems like a long ways off, but that is a few months away. And then your applications will be emailed. We've got in round 2, we've set up a separate email account just to keep them separate from the rest of my general emails this time around. So your application will be emailed. Will be emailed to gvrr@landmarksociety.org. Again, this is just for the final application when you submit it. Otherwise, this email is not being monitored, so you don't want to send questions to that. I'll give you my general email at the end, so that's where all questions can go. Applications must be completed and signed electronically. In round 2, it does have to be filled out in the fillable PDF form, and all information has to be sent in the PDF form in a single document. And we at Landmark Society are available for site visits, technical guidance, and general application assistance. We can't fill out your application for you, but we can certainly help provide guidance to getting that through. And as far as site visits, you want to make a request to me for a site visit by January 15th. And that's just so that we can make sure that we can get everybody scheduled in time and have a site visit with you prior to you needing to finish your application. All right, so now we will move through the application and what's in the application form. So if you did apply during round 1, some of this will be redundant to you, but there have been some minor changes made. So if you applied in round 1, please do make sure you reach out to me for an application because it is a different application. So we start with the historic resource. You'll have to include the property name, This is something that your property is commonly known as. If there's a historic name associated with it, you can include that, or you can just call it the whatever building it is you use it for today, or just use its address. There's not really a wrong answer to the property name. You'll also have to include the historic, current, and proposed use. That's just so we have an idea of where the building came from and where you're going with it. Date of construction. This is not completely important, but we do want you to at least approximate when the building was constructed. And if you need help with that, you can always contact myself. And then the National Register status. We have additional information in the application instructions that tell you how to find out if your building is already listed or not, if you're not sure. But you're always welcome to reach out to me, and I can also get you that information pretty quickly. Okay, then we move on to the applicant or the organization who's applying for the grant. So there's a number of different contact information that we ask for. The first is the applicant or the organization, and that's who's applying for the funding. So let's say you're a historical society or you're a business, that's where you want to use the business name or your organization's name. Then you have the applicant or organization contact. That should be an actual person, so we need a name to that. That could be your president, your treasurer, whoever owns the business or the building, but that should be that person's name. Then we need a project contact, again, a person's name, and that can be the same person as the applicant or organization contact. The project contact should be the person who would be my main point of contact should I have questions about your application. This should also be the main person who contacts me via email about the application and the process. And then a municipal contact. Many of your applications won't need to have a municipal contact, but this would be someone associated with your local government. And this is if you're pursuing funding in coordination with your municipality. So for example, if you are going to have to have a national register listing done, but you're in a district and your municipality is applying for the national register to be done, then that's when you would need this contact. Or if you're local government, you would also need this contact information. Then there is the project discussion. And this is just asking if you've reached out and talked to me yet about your project. Some of your projects may be fairly simple, but it is always a good idea to reach out to me so I can at least give you an initial thumbs up that your project appears to be eligible for the grant funding. I would hate for anyone to submit something March 31st and find out it's not even eligible for the program. So it's just going to ask if we've talked via phone, email, or if we had a site visit. Then your applicant status. So we just need you to check off if you're a nonprofit, a 501c3, or a nonprofit of any kind. We are aware that there are multiple different types of 501c3s. If you're a unit of local government, or if you're just a private owner of a building applying. And then ownership, so just a yes or no about whether or not you're the legal owner of the building. And if you're not, you do need to give us the contact information for the legal owner of the building. And just so that we know that they're aware that there's an application coming in for funding to do work on their building. And then we do ask if there's a local historic society, preservation organization, or a development organization. Again, this is not the most important question in your application. This is more for our own information, so we know where our local partners are located. If you're not sure if you have one in your area, you can leave that blank. That won't affect your application. Again, that's just more information we're collecting. Okay, now into the meat of the application. There will be a few projects or slides here where I'm going to be talking about different types of projects. So the first part is your project description, and this is for building repair or rehabilitation projects. So those of you that are coming in to do actual work to your building. You'll need to describe all of the work to the building. Again, as I mentioned, you can only apply for up to $50,000 worth of work to your building, but you could have a larger project ongoing. So for example, if you're rehabilitating a completely vacant building, that $50,000 may only get you a new roof and some repointing of the exterior, where you're actually doing a whole rehab of the interior. We want to know about that entire project. So you'll describe all of that. And then in the next question, you'll describe the specifics of your grant funded work. So what is the work specifically that you're applying for grant funding for? So in the case that I just gave, if you're doing a full rehabilitation of a building, it could be that you're redoing storefronts to be historically appropriate, you're putting in apartments on the upper floors, and that you are repairing windows, and then that the grant funded work would be for roof replacement and mortar repair. And then a description of the building conditions. You want to be as specific as you can when you're answering these questions. Again, this is going to be a competitive program, so you really want to justify in all of your responses to these questions why should your project be funded. So giving us a good description of your building conditions is going to be a really good way for our review panel to understand what is the real need of your project. So you want to make sure if there are issues with your building and you're trying to address those, that you're letting us know that. You don't want to give us just necessarily 2 sentences on here. There's room for more. And you really want to make sure that you make that justification. Then also importance to maintaining the function and return to use. Again, you may have a building that's already in use and there's just some maintenance that needs to be done, and that's fine. It doesn't make your project less important, but you just want to make sure that you're explaining to us why this is important. So if you're returning a vacant building to use, tell us why that's important to your community. Why is it important for the building? If you have a building that's already in use, but tell us why the work that you're applying for needs to be done in order to continue to use the building. That's typically so that you can avoid further deterioration, but let us know what that is. And then a professional building assessment. We're going to ask if you have had the building looked at by a professional contractor, engineer, depending on what your work is. There will be some applications that may not require this because you have a pretty simple scope of work. But if you're trying to address structural issues or other highly important deterioration issues, it's a good idea to have a professional look at the building and assess it. That way we know that the work that you're applying for really is necessary for the building. Then your project timeline, as mentioned earlier, your project needs to be completed within 2 years of being awarded funding. So we just want a timeline where you kind of show, it doesn't have to be exact. We all know that project timelines can change during construction, but give us an approximate start date of when you'd want to start, knowing that work cannot start until you have your final approval from the State Historic Preservation Office, meaning you've already gone through your grant agreement process with them. So just kind of give us an estimated start date of when you'd like to start, and maybe some benchmark goals of dates or months that you'd like to have certain projects done by, and then again, an estimate of when your project would be completed. Then you would also need to include construction drawings or conditions assessments and specifications if your project is going to include something like storefront replacement on a building. If you're doing rehab to the interior, so you're putting in apartments where they're not already, or you're putting in new walls to create new commercial spaces in your building, something like that. Basically, if you're changing the layout or appearance of your building in any way, you would need to include construction drawings so that we have an idea of what you're proposing to do. Again, this is to make sure that you are complying with preservation requirements. If your project includes something like this, please do reach out to me. I can confirm if these are things that you would need, and also kind of give you an idea of to what extent do we need to see drawings. All right, project description for survey and National Register projects. So again, if you're applying to have a survey or a National Register nomination completed, this would be the time for you to pay attention. In this, we would need to know your scope and boundary of the project. So generally, when you are listing, especially a district, to the National Register, we need to understand what all is included. So what is the boundary, what buildings are being included, and why? Like, have you, so basically you need to have talked to the State Historic Preservation Office to really know that your project can be listed and therefore can be funded. So you want to include that. Your importance of the building, town, and village. This is a very brief kind of historic significance of why it's going to be listed. Then we would not want to know the estimated number of resources. If you're doing an individual building listing, this would just be whatever's being included in that listing. It could be just one main contributing building. It could have some outbuildings. You want to include those. If it's a district, we need to know approximately how many buildings are going to be included within that district boundary. Then we also want to know if you've had a discussion with SHPO. As I said, when you're having a survey or a national register done, these are things that the State Historic Preservation Office will need to concur with any findings. So it's a really good idea to reach out to them ahead of time to make sure that if your project is funded, we don't find out later that they're saying your building or your district isn't eligible for listing. So we can talk with you individually on that if that's your project. We can also answer questions at the end if that's something you're looking at. And then, of course, when you're doing these, generally you would hire a professional preservation consultant to do the work. So we'd want to see some the estimates that go with that, to see their proposal and what they're going to plan to do for that project. All right, then we get into community impact. And this is for repair and rehabilitation projects again. So the first question, we will have you explain how the building is serving members of the surrounding community and how it has a positive impact on the community's cultural and social life and economy. Again, we're really trying to stress, funding projects in our rural areas to bring back life to these buildings. So we want to understand why this is important. Why is your project important to the community? How is it serving the community? And you want to include things such as cultural and social life, but also the economic impact should there be one. Also include how many, how often the property will be open to the public. So that's something that will be really important. If your building is never open to the public, it probably won't be as competitive of a project, again, because we're really basing this on the community impact. What kind of impact this project will have. So you'll include the hours per week, days per week, months in the year that you'll be open. And this is also where you can describe if right now you have limited hours due to, for example, we hear from a lot of like historical society museums, they don't have the proper heating to be open in the winter. And so maybe that's what they're applying for. So this would also be the place where you say, if we're funded, here's what we would like our open hours to be to the public. And here's how we can expand our public programs because we can be open more often. And that doesn't just have to be a historical society. That could be a business. That could be a number of things. And then is the building currently, or will the building be accessible to individuals with disabilities? This again won't make or break your project. You do not have to be applying for something that's ADA accessible related in order to be funded. But it is nice to know that the building either is or will be accessible to all people, therefore, having a greater community impact. And then also letters of support. These are optional but recommended, and I would say highly recommended. This really will help bolster your application and show the community support for this, which I think in turn really shows the community impact you're going to have. So again, while these are optional, I really recommend that your application come in with at least one letter of recommendation. And these, people often ask, who do we get those from? That can be anything from a downtown development corporation, your mayor or the village or the town, your historical society. It could come from a number of places, generally somebody or an organization that has a leadership role in the community are always good places to start for those. And then your community impact for survey or national register listed projects. It'll be a little different, but explain how the project will serve members of the surrounding community and how it has a positive impact, again, on the community's cultural and social life and economy. So basically we want to know, if you're funded and you go through with this listing or this survey, how will that impact, how will that have a positive impact on the community? And that could be anything from allowing, eventually allowing homeowners within the district to be able to use homeowner tax credits to repair their houses. Same thing with commercial buildings using the commercial tax credit program. It could just be that your community has great pride in their history, and being listed on the National Register is something that would further that pride and maybe help with tourism in the economy in your area. And also, are you in an eligible census tract? So when you're looking at the National Register, often people are doing that to become eligible for financial incentives such as the tax credit program, which you'd have to be inside of an eligible census tract for. We do have information on how to find out whether or not you're in an eligible census tract, but as always, please reach out to me. I can help you with that information as well. And again, support letters, optional, but highly, highly recommended. All right, then we move into community needs. So this is, it's somewhat related to your community impact, but this is where we kind of veered off from round one and are asking some important questions that came out of some feedback from round one. So the first one is going to be the population of the village or town. So this is us partially checking to make sure that it's eligible and making sure you know whether or not you're eligible. And then what is the population size of the county where the project is located? And then we do ask what the percent below poverty level is. In the application instructions, I've got links and details on how to figure this out. We're also here to help you through that. I know it can be a little confusing, but I won't go into details on that here, but know that in the application instructions, there are detailed instructions and links to help you figure that out. And then also explain how your project will meet the local need in the community. So for example, if your building provides a public meeting space, or does the community lack public meeting spaces? Is the community experiencing population loss or disinvestment? Is the project filling a previously vacant building, or an underutilized building, bringing a building back to life? Let us know that here, how you'll meet the local community need. Then we move into the funding need. This is going to be where we really want to know what the funding need is for the project. Of course, if you have other funding sources, this does not make you ineligible for this program. But our first question that you would have to answer is list any public or private grant funds that the site has received in the last 5 years. We just want to know, what have you been doing with your building for the last 5 years? Have you received other grant or financial assistance? Again, that will not make your building ineligible or less competitive. We just want to see sometimes knowing that you've been working on your building and are trying to finish it up or moving forward is a good thing. Then you'll also provide a brief explanation of why the project needs funding. So what are the financing needs and what has already been addressed, and where are the gaps in funding? So it could be that you've received another grant to work on a larger project at your building, but it doesn't quite cover your roof, or it doesn't quite cover your heating system, or whatever it is you're going to be applying for. Let us know what that is and how this funding will help cover that gap to complete your project. And then also explain any repercussions if the project doesn't receive giver grant funding. This question isn't meant to be a sob story, but we do want to know, if you aren't funded, what will happen to the building? I really hope you don't write in that you're going to demolish the building if you don't get funding, but if there is, a real, if there is something that could jeopardize the building if you don't receive funding and help to do the project, we want to know that, so that we really know that, that you aren't getting help other places. And that is kind of the purpose of this grant, is to be helping our rural communities where you don't always have a whole lot of other funding coming into you. All right, and then moving along into our project budget and grant request. This, for those of you who applied in round one, you'll probably be very excited to see this page, because it is not the table that we had in the last application, which was very confusing. We've made it much simpler and are only asking the questions we really need to know this time around. So the first question is going to ask you to briefly describe how the budget and costs were determined. And this is where you'll include contractor, consultant, and vendor estimates. Just to put it out there that this time around, those estimates are required to be submitted with your application. The grant review panel will need to see where you got your numbers from, and making sure that the amount you're requesting is a realistic number. So you will be required to submit estimates this time around with your round two application. You don't have to have, there is no specific number you have to have. It can be one estimate, it can be 3 estimates. We just need to see the reality of where you're getting your grant request from. Then you'll want to list any other potential or actual sources of financial support for the project. This could be, you're putting in your personal funding. There's a savings account that you have put away for this project, and this is just helping with that. Again, it could be that you have the funding to pay for the project, but it would deplete your organization's account. And so this would be a way for you to pay for this project without completely depleting that, that source of income. If you're going to be getting a loan for the project, we would want to know that. So anywhere else that you'll have money coming in for the overall project or the specific project, we would like to know that information. And then for municipalities only. So if you're a municipality, local government applying for a project, we would need to know how would the grant funding complement funding allocated for building maintenance and repair through the town, village, or county budget. So we need to understand why the grant would be needed versus what your budget may be for your local municipality to do the project. And then because this is a reimbursable grant, again, I'll say that again, this is a reimbursable grant, we would need to know how the project will be paid for upfront. So if you are awarded, after you get the final approval from the State Preservation Office, you will have to pay for this work up front to have the work done. Once you're done with the project, that's when you submit all that final paperwork to the state, show that the work has been done, and they reimburse you with your grant funding. So we need to know upfront, how are you going to make sure that you can do this project before you have the grant funding? This can be anything from a loan from a bank. It could be someone's putting up their personal money. It could be that your organization has the money in their account and you're going to just, once you get that grant reimbursement, it will bolster your account back up to what it was. But how are you going to pay for this upfront? Then we ask for your total project costs. So this is everything that you're going to be doing to the building. So again, you're going back to that question where we asked you to describe work to the building. This would be that total project cost related to all of the work ongoing at the building. And then you would do your grant request. So that's specific to the work that you're applying for this grant for, anywhere from $5,000 to $50,000. And you'll put that on a line that's on that same page. And again, I just want to let you know that preparation of any architectural or engineering plans and specifications, you can only receive up to 20% of your total grant amount to cover those. The rest of it does have to be for actual capital work to your building, rehabilitation work to your building. But I think those of you who applied in round one will like this budget page much more than you did in round one. All right, in a new section in round two that we are going to be asking about, it's called applicant capacity. This is just us making sure that you'll be able to see this grant through. So the first question is going to be, how will you ensure a timely and organized completion of the project? So how will you ensure that the proposed project is completed according to the details outlined in your grant agreement? And do you have an architect if necessary? Do you have experience working with contractors on other projects? Or have you completed other rehabilitation or repair projects on this or other historic buildings? So we just kind of want to know, what is your ability to see the project through? Just because this might be your first time doing one of these projects, that does not mean that we don't think that you have the capacity to do the grant program. We just need to make sure that you understand the things that will be required and have somebody on your team who can help you through that process. Then you'll also need to explain how you'll track your expenditures and reimbursement requests. Again, you'll need to save all of your financial documents as you go through the project. When you pay a contractor, that will all have to be submitted to the state in the end with your reimbursement request. So, what will you do? Are you going to keep a binder of paper copies? Do you keep spreadsheets? You'll still need those paper copies of everything, but we just want to know how you're going to track that. And then if the application is successful, how will you ensure that the project stays on schedule and within the budget? We all know that construction projects can veer sometimes and things happen. So we just ask that you keep us in the loop when those things happen. But overall, again, just how will you make sure this project stays on task? And then you will have to check an attestation box on this page that says that you understand that listing in the National Register of Historic Places is a requirement of the giver grant funding. So again, if you're not already listed, you will have to be listed before you can be reimbursed for this grant. So again, this is just some eligible and ineligible expenses. So you know what you can include, what in your grant request itself. Your eligible expenses are capital improvement costs. They're part of or permanently attached to the building. So we like to tell people, if you pick your building up and it doesn't have a roof on it and you shake it, what's going to fall out? That's probably not an eligible expense. What stays in or attached, probably an eligible expense. I won't read down the list here. I know you all can probably read that. But again, just some ideas of what can be included in your eligible expenses. Again, things that are done to the building itself. And then ineligible expenses would include things like personnel or salaries involved with and related to the project, your contractor's travel, or even your organization or employee travel, gas, and meals are not eligible reimbursement expenses. You can't turn in a McDonald's receipt, for example. Office supplies and materials, so things like printing paper and pencils and pens, printers, you can't turn that in. Equipment, so things like excavators and things like that would not be an eligible expense. Tools, saws, paintbrushes, that sort of thing that you can keep and they're reusable, those are not eligible expenses. And then of course your furniture and decor, and then landscaping and site work. Again, only things to the building itself would be an eligible expense. And then of course your historic resource surveys and National Register nominations are an eligible expense. All right, so support letters and attachments. Again, your support letters are, or your letters of support are optional, but again, highly, highly recommended. If I were submitting an application, I probably would not submit it without at least one letter of support. You do need your contractor, your consultant, or your vendor estimates to be submitted with the application. Again, that's so that our grant review committee can ensure that what you're requesting and funding aligns appropriately with what the project cost would actually be. And then you need to submit photographs. This is anything exterior and interior that are representative of your project. And the number of photos really depends on the size of your building and the complexity of your project. So we don't necessarily need every room and every space this time, but we do need things that, if you're going to be doing interior work, we need to see an overall of the space that you're doing work in. However, if you're only doing interior work, you do still need to submit exterior photographs of your building. We need to know what your building looks like. Then drawings and sketches, as I talked about before, if you're making layout or design changes, you'll need to submit architectural drawings. And then existing demolition and proposed drawings, if you're doing something like changing the layout of the building, would need to be included. And again, you can contact me directly if you have questions about whether or not your application would require those. Specifications, so if you're doing things like putting in new windows, we would need to know what windows you're putting in. So you need to submit the manufacturer product information on the windows that you're proposing to use. Then you also need to submit a map of your town or village, wherever your building is, that clearly marks where your building is. This can be something as simple as pulling off a Google map and circling where your building is, or putting a big X over it. It doesn't have to be a fancy map. And then the application checklist, which I'll show you here. It's similar to round one. You just go down the list, and that's really for your benefit to make sure you're submitting everything that's needed with your application. So you just go down the list and check those off as you get them and submit that with your application. So the application evaluation, we have put together a grant review panel. It's the same grant review panel from round one. They're professionals in architecture and preservation and all sorts of things, most of who have experience with reviewing these. It's so that we kind of pull people in from all around. So you're getting a good read on your applications from a lot of different perspectives. And we'll be evaluating your application based on the different categories on the screen here. Those are funding priorities, your project description, community impact, the community need, the funding need, your budget, schedule, and scope, the applicant capacity, and the overall application. And as we go through, each of those things is assigned a specific number. And so that's how we go through and we rank and rate each of the projects to find out in the end who scores highest to be funded. And again, if you have questions about this, please let us know. All right, this is where I'll give you a little more information on those Secretary of the Interior standards. Again, I mentioned that this is a preservation related grant, so you do have to follow preservation standards with your work. So the standards are a set of guidelines set by the National Park Service, and they're used to review state and federally funded projects. So for example, your project being awarded through this grant. While there are 10 guidelines that are in the standards, there's 4 key points that you get out of them. And that's that buildings are used for their historic purpose, or a new one that does not require significant alterations of a historic building. So for example, if the new use of your building is going to require a 5-story addition on the top of it, you're not going to meet preservation standards. Things like that. Generally, this isn't that big of a deal, and I would venture to guess that most of your projects aren't going to make issue with that first point. The second is that you should retain your historic materials and features. They're what make your building historically significant and eligible for programs like these. Then where deteriorated beyond repair, your historic materials and features should be replaced in kind. So generally that means wood for wood, stone, doing that sort of thing. If you have questions about using an alternate material, please reach out to me. For example, if you're going to be applying for window replacement, I'll just let you know up front that vinyl windows would not be approved. Generally, if you currently have vinyl windows, reach out and talk to us individually about that. But if you have wood windows now, something like a vinyl window would not meet this standard. And then alterations and additions must not destroy historic materials, and they need to be compatible. So if you're going to be putting an addition onto your building, although would not be an eligible expense for this program because that's new construction. But if you're going to be doing that, that's going to be reviewed as part of the overall project. An addition should be kind of subservient to the historic building, shouldn't come off the front of the building, that sort of thing. So that's a general overview of what the standards are. But if you've got questions specifically about your project and meeting those standards, feel free to reach out to me. We can let you know if you're headed in the right direction or not, and give you, if you're not headed in the right direction, we can give you guidance on what would be the better option in order to be eligible for this program. Then, of course, because you do need to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places, for those of you who are not already listed, or for those of you who are but just aren't quite sure what it is, this is an honorary designation. So there are no restrictions to private property owners unless you're using state or federal funding. So for example, that's why you're going to be reviewed by the state for this program if you're funded, because you're getting that federal state funding. But otherwise, it's an honorary designation. It doesn't tell you what you can and can't do with your building. It promotes heritage tourism and economic development. It raises awareness and pride in your community's past. It opens the door for things like state and federal historic tax credit programs, and then also can open the door for other preservation grant and loan programs that your property could become eligible for. So really, in the end, it's a win-win type of designation. There's really no downside to it. All right, and then finally, I'm going to end with some reminders and deadlines. The round 2 application is due March 31st, 2022. That's at 11:59 p.m. So make sure you get those in by then. Also, we're happy to answer questions and provide support. And we can also do site visits with you to discuss your project. If you would like a site visit, please send an email to me. My email's on the screen here. It's mclem@landmarksociety.org. And please try to get your request into me by January 15th. It's not a hard and fast cutoff, but we do want to make sure that we can get everybody scheduled in time, and we aren't waiting till the last minute to meet with you. So please do try to get your requests in by January 15th if you have that. And just as a caveat to that, not every project requires a site visit. So if it's something that's a bit more simple, then I may counteract and ask if we can do a phone call instead. But please do reach out if you've got questions. We can do a phone call, we can chat by email, or we can set up a site visit. If you applied in round 1, you do still need to request an application from me. Again, the round 2 application is different from round 1. And then also, when you are requesting an application, please do send the request and all of your questions and that to my mclem@landmarksociety.org email. Please do make sure that in the subject line, you're including GVRR, or you can write out the grant name if you want to, and your building address. The reason I ask you to do that is because we do get a lot of applications in, and I want to make sure that I'm responding to and keeping track of my conversation with you and what we've talked about. And it's a lot easier to search for that than it is for just random other names in an email that I may never find. So please do try to, if you can remember, to put in the subject line GVRR in your building address. And then I do ask that each project kind of have one contact person that's reaching out to me about your project. If you have 5 people emailing me about the application of the project, sometimes it's very confusing very quickly, and sometimes mixed communication between people in your organization or your project. So do try to assign just one person that reaches out to me about your project. You're welcome to CC people on the email, and I'll make sure I reply all, but having one contact is going to be easiest for this. And then what else? Do make sure that if you are not already listed in the National Register, the State Historic Preservation Office will need to do a determination of eligibility for your building in order for you to be eligible for this program. You'll find out more about that in the application instructions and how to go through that. But you do need to make sure that if you need that determination of eligibility, it has to be completed by March 31st, 2022. Their letter of eligibility needs to be submitted with your application. So again, reach out to me if you have questions about that, whether or not you're listed or if you need to have that determination completed, and I'll let you know if that's something you need to do. I would say you want to make sure you do that at least a month and a half in advance of submitting that request to them, at least a month and a half in advance of the application deadline here, just to give them time to review. Sometimes they have to come back to you for a little more information, and that gives you time to get that for them as well. And then one other reminder is that your application does have to be submitted in the pages provided, in the spots provided. We won't accept continuation sheets. You want to make sure that you are giving a thorough response and making your justification in each of those areas and each of the questions, but continuation pages are not going to be accepted in round 2. And that it does need to be done. It's a fillable PDF form. So once I send it to you, you can open it up and you just start typing in that form. And then we do ask that all information be submitted in a single PDF form. There's instructions on how to do that. There's plenty of free PDF mergers online that you can use to put everything together. But it would come in as just one PDF, and then your images should be JPEG images. So if you need to, in the email to submit your application becomes too large, you can send a link to a Dropbox or something like that that has your application and your photographs in it. But please do note in the application that the photographs should be in JPEG format, not included in that PDF. And they do need to be labeled. And there's an example in the application instructions on how to label your photographs. So I think that is all of the reminders. Again, March 31st, 2022 is your application deadline. We here at the Landmark Society are here to answer your questions, come do site visits with you, help you through the application process. Please feel free to reach out to me at any time. We're here to help you with this. We want this to be an easy and smooth process for you. So, please don't feel flustered. If you're starting to, please do reach out to me. I'm happy to help you. And with that, I think we'll kick it over to questions.
Great. Thank you, Megan. I'll start with the questions that are in the chat. I'll go back to the beginning and we'll work our way through. We got some good questions that have come in. So first question, would the Cuba Garlic Festival and other festival types fit? And there's a second part to that question. They're building, this may be something we can address offline with this particular applicant, but their village is their building is half in the village and half in the town. But what about the first part of that question?
So like funding to hold a festival, I think is what they're asking.
That's my read.
No, we've been holding the festival for 16 years. It's a well-established festival. We hold it every September and we have nearly 10,000 people there in a weekend.
So events are not eligible That's a pretty easy one. So it has to be a building repair rehab project, that's something, some repair to an actual physical building, or it has to be a National Register nomination or a historic resources survey.
Okay, well, it's a historic building and the festival is held on the grounds of the historic building. The building is open for tours and there are other events at this facility as well.
You
So
can,
it's, we're not,
the
and
building,
it's on the, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places for the past 20 years. And it's had a New York State grant originally for roof work, $25,000. So it's well established. We've been through other grant processes. and-
Yes, so I think then what you were asking is the building eligible, and some of the community impact and use of the building is outdoor festivals. Okay, so then yes, in your application, you'd be applying for work to the physical building, but yes,
Oh, yeah.
for community impact, you can include the fact that the grounds and the building is open during those festivals. So that would be part of your community impact part. Yes.
and then regarding the second half of the question, if someone has, you know, a unique situation where you're kind of half in and half out of one municipality or the other, reach out directly to Megan and we can certainly address that. How do we find out if we are listed in the National Register, Megan?
Sure. So if you have not already reached out to me for the application and the instructions, please do. You can, I'll make sure that I get those out to you as quickly as possible when you request it. So the instructions walk you through how to do that, how to find that out. You do it through the state's cultural resource information system. However, I am happy if you can send me your building address. I would be happy to look that information up for you. I can do it very quickly. So if it's quicker for you just to have me do it for you, please make sure that you send me the building address. So I get requests sometimes asking if their building is eligible, but they don't tell me where their building is. So, so yes, we can do that for you.
Next question, for reimbursement, can funds be released for each phase of the project? Can we get reimbursed for the first contract, or, you know, if you've got multiple kind of elements to a project, if one contractor finishes their portion of the work first, can you get reimbursed for that portion?
Sure. So, Fran, I will let you tell me, jump in if I'm wrong, but I believe so. I think if once you've finished one work item, it needs to be fully finished and you can show that it's been paid in full, you could incrementally be reimbursed. You want to make sure though that you can still get all those projects done within that 2-year time frame. But you could, let's say that you applied for funding for a roof replacement, some mortar repair, and painting of your building. If you get the roof on, you can submit all that to the state and they can reimburse you for the roof. And then you move on to the next project.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think when it comes to that time, you know, and you are awarded a grant and we start the process of going to contract between OPRHP and your organization, I will be providing lots of information to the Landmark Society to then to distribute to subgrantee applicants about how the reimbursement and the payment process works. There'll be, you know, a set of requirements of things that you're able to submit in order to get reimbursed for the projects that you've been doing. But phasing it, you know, that's certainly a really good approach, and we'll work individually with each one of you to make sure that that you're being reimbursed in a way that makes sense to you and that also follows the rules and regulations of the grant program. So.
And we did have a question, I can address this one, wondering if we have, well, the first part of the question, sorry, I skipped over that. For folks who applied in round 1, can those estimates from round 1 be used for round 2? Or do they need to get new estimates since it's been?
Yes, so we would recommend that you get new estimates just because there has been quite a bit of time between the two programs. And I know with everything going on in the construction world, that, you know, sometimes prices have gone up. And this is more to protect you than anything, to make sure that what you're applying for really will cover your project. I mean, that's not to say that you couldn't submit the one you used in the first round, but I would definitely highly recommend that you reach out to your contractor and just ask for an updated estimate. If they tell you the numbers haven't changed, then just ask them to update the date on their estimate maybe. But I think that that would be best. That really helps show the grant review panel too that your numbers are accurate, because I think that will be something that they ask while they're reviewing is how accurate is this if it's outdated.
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback on that a little bit in that the point of having the formal estimates to submit with the grant application is the real meat of what the grant panel will be evaluating. You know, aside from community impact, we want to be able to make decisions appropriately about how these funds from the National Park Service are going to be invested. So having a clear roadmap through estimates of exactly what you're going to do to the building, it will help create a smoother contracting process as well as a more organized grant application, because we'll have a clear picture of what it is we're actually evaluating.
And we also had so the same person asked about contractors. If you can use some assistance in getting contractor names, we don't recommend, Landmark Society does not recommend, we don't have an approved contractor list per se, but we do kind of maintain a list of folks that we know are doing work or have experience, you know, as a mason, a plasterer, a carpenter, that type of thing. So if you could use some names, you can certainly reach out to Megan as part of your reaching out process to get the application. She can try and give you some contractor names that may or may not be helpful because it's you know, it's always difficult to get those contractor estimates and get folks on board. Next question, will a previous giver award recipient be eligible to apply again for another crucial project?
So the general answer is yes. There's nothing that precludes you from applying in round two. I think there's a potential that the review committee would be looking to fund, you know, projects that didn't already get funded. However, the funded projects do end up being the ones that score highest during the ranking and rating process. So, I mean, I guess the answer is yes, you're eligible to apply again in round two. But do note that if you were awarded in round one, you are not guaranteed, nor is anybody else guaranteed funding in round two.
Can a project, so, and I think this is just a clarification, Megan, can folks apply just to do a National Register district, even if they don't have a building repair project to go along with it?
Yes, so the only way that you can use this grant program outside of actually doing physical work to your building would be for the Historic Resources Survey or a National Register nomination.
And can you file more than one application? I don't know if we've
I don't think we cover that. So you can only submit one application per building. So for example, if you have multiple work items that you could fit in under that $50,000 maximum award, you would include that all in one application. So it's not an application per work item, it's one application for all of your work items. So you can only get up to $50,000 per building. However, if you own multiple buildings and you want to do, you know, you want to try for funding on multiple buildings, then you would submit an application per building for each building. Again, if you receive funding for one building, it doesn't guarantee you receive funding for another. And I would also say, because this is a competitive program, if you have two buildings and you really think that one building would be a lot more competitive than the other, we kind of recommend that maybe you pick the one that you think would be most competitive and apply for that, just so you can really focus on a really great application and, you know, in a way not make it even more competitive against yourself, but you can submit more than one application. It just has to be per building.
Can folks who applied in round one resubmit the letters of support from round one? Can they use the same support letters?
That's a great question. I think that if you are submitting the same scope of work, In reality, that would probably work to use the same letters of support. However, I would say with our grant review panel, again, if they see an older date on a letter of support, they may question that. I mean, I think that we would all assume that they would still support your project, but you may want to reach out to those people who did letters of support and just ask for an updated letter.
And okay, we can use a clarification on the National Register eligibility requirement. For round 2, you don't need to already be listed on the National Register in order to apply, but you do, if you are not already listed, you do need to have gotten that evaluation of eligibility, correct?
That's correct. So if you're already listed on the National Register, you're fine and you can skip that step of the application process. If your building is not already listed, then you will need to go through that evaluation of eligibility. At the end of the application instructions, there will be a sheet that walks you through how to do that. That is something that you have to submit. We can't do that on your behalf. I can help clarify how you do that if you need it, but it is a fairly straightforward process. And the people at the state who evaluate those for you are very helpful.
And maybe where wires could gets confusing here is that if you do receive a grant award and you aren't already listed in the National Register, as a condition of the grant, you then do have to proceed with getting the property listed in the National Register.
Yeah, so I'm going to add a couple things to that. If you know when you're applying that you're eligible, but you're not yet listed, it would be a really good idea to work in the costs of completing that National Register nomination into your budget worksheet, whether that's something that you're going to be providing as a match or whether or not it's something that you'd be utilizing that grant funding for, because that's a good, clear way to demonstrate that you understand that it's an expectation if your project is funded, that portion of the project go through.
Really good point. Next question. Since the grant application is time consuming for all parties, is there an opportunity if a site visit is conducted to let us know if it is worth proceeding with the submission of an application?
Yes, so I think this is kind of an iffy answer to the question. So, I mean, the reality is if we do a site visit or we have a phone call or by email, you tell me what your project is going to be, and it really seems like something that just would not be competitive in any way, shape, or form. We really wouldn't see a way where you'd be funded over other projects. I mean, we could let you know that. We certainly don't want you to waste your time. However, just remember that even with all the people on this call now, we still don't know what all projects will be submitted. So it's hard to say that your project wouldn't be competitive just because we don't know what's being submitted. But, you know, if we talk to you and it really is something that we know would not be competitive, we can be honest with you if that's helpful for you, sure. But I
also
certainly would want to talk you out of applying for grant funding. So,
and keep in mind too that you know, Megan, Francis, and I, we are not the grant review panel. So you know, while we can certainly provide our interpretation as to whether a project is a strong application, makes a strong application, ultimately we aren't the ones making that decision. So on the application, when you're listing the grants that you've received, can you include or should you include grants that you've received for programming rather than for specifically building, repair, or preservation projects?
I think, Fran, I guess I might want to know if that's something that the state would want to know in the end. I would say overall that might not be as important to list. I think we want to know more about funding you've received for physical work to the building. But I mean, you could certainly tell us if you have, but I think the building work is more important.
Yeah, building work, having an understanding of what preservation work, if it was grant funded or not, that has been done to the building already would be very helpful. But if describing past grants that you've gotten for programming is going to help you describe or further explain community impact, you know, by all means. So something like a festival or a grant that you've got for a theater program or some other kind of community event that brought a lot of people to that historic resource, to enjoy that historic resource, you know, that would be a perfectly appropriate place to work in for that kind of information. But certainly any type of preservation work that's occurred at the structure, we definitely would like to know about.
This is a good question. I mean, they're all good questions, but Will evaluators consider awarding less than the amount that's requested?
So the answer to that is mostly a no. If you're funded, you are likely to get the funding in full that you requested. The only way that that might change is if for some reason your contractor estimates are very outdated. We do have some people on our panel who are pretty well versed in kind of the construction world, having an idea of what things cost. So if you're requesting, $50,000 for something that in reality is only going to cost 10,000, then that could be a case where the review panel could say it's not a $50,000 project. So this is where your contractor estimates are going to be very important so that we understand in full and up to date what the project really is going to cost. I would say the reality of you not receiving the full amount you ask for if you're funded would be, for example, if you are the final project that gets into the funding where we have just a certain amount left over, you could potentially end up with only receiving whatever that amount is left over, just because as a grant program, we have no way to stretch the amount of money we have. We just have what we have. So I would say that would be more realistically how you might not receive the full amount, but generally you're going to receive the full amount you request if you're funded.
Sort of related to that, Megan, do we know how many awards will be given?
So that again will depend on what's requested and the amount requested on the applications and where they fall in line. In round one, we had a little over 300,000 to give out. We had $3 million in requests. So there were, in the end, there were 6 awarded projects. I think in round two, we've got a little bit more to give out. The way things worked in the splitting of the total amount that we have in this Paul Brunn grant, there's a little more to give out in round two. So I would say there's probably going to be more projects, definitely would be more projects funded in round two.
And in terms of timeline, when do we have an expectation of when the awards will be announced for the second round?
We don't have a specific date in mind for when round 2 awards are going to be announced, but we're hoping to move through that in a very streamlined process and try to get some stuff going, because we also have to be mindful of construction season and New York State weather patterns. So something we'll do our best on, but we don't have a specific date right now.
Right, and just so that you all are aware of how this kind of works, so your application will be due on March 31st. From there, we kind of do an initial read through all the applications, making sure that you've completed the whole thing and, reaching out just in case there's something missing. I mean, we can't reach out to ask you to complete your application. That just needs to be done on time. But, if there's little things here or there, we may reach out to you to fix that. And then from there, we meet with our grant review panel towards the end of May. So that's when we do all the ranking and rating. The reason there's that time, about a month and a half in between, is we get a lot of applications and we need time to read through all of them, which can take a while. So we meet with the grant review panel towards the end of May. And then from there is when we start our process with the state, outlining the top scoring projects, going through all of that. So there's a lot of contracting and things that have to happen behind the scenes, which is why there's a little bit of time between that before an announcement can be made.
And then just this is a clarification for folks on the population question. So I see a question about it. If you are in a hamlet, not a village, you're going to use the population count for the town you're in, because a hamlet is unincorporated. It's not an official governmental entity. So if you're in a hamlet, you use the town population, unless your hamlet is within a village, but that's not usually the case. A hamlet is usually out in a town. So again, a hamlet's not a unit of local government. So you're either in a village or you're in a town. So hopefully that helps. How likely is it that 2 buildings in the same village or town would receive funding?
So so that is likely. Again, it all depends on and shakes out to how the applications rank and rate with our grant review panel. So we don't add points or subtract points to try to keep one town or village from receiving, from multiple building owners in that town from receiving the grant. It all just depends on how they rank and rate in the scoring process.
So we had a question about what the grant panel is. The grant panel is us folks. It's not a pre-existing panel from another entity. This is a panel that we've convened specifically for this grant program. And as Megan mentioned, it's folks from across New York State who are, we have architects, preservation professionals, grassroots preservationists, a really good representation. Fran, following up on the question about prior grants, would you want to know about all prior restoration preservation work or just previous grant covered work?
So I believe there's a question in the application that asks about previous preservation activities. It may be too exhaustive for you to list, line by line, every single work item that you've done to the building. However, if you're coming from an organization that has literally rescued a vacant building and you've done a lot of work on your own, as well as gathered grants, painting some complete picture of how you've taken to maintain and preserve that building is going to be a good thing to explain. Whereas if you just said, oh, we got a grant to replace the roof, but we don't know about all the other good activity that you've done to keep that resource standing, you don't want to leave those details out. So you don't have to list every single thing line by line, but painting some clear picture of the work that you've done so that we can get a sense of how you've been using the building and maintaining it is going to definitely make for a strong answer to that question.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of you're painting a picture for the grant review panel, whether it's that prior grant question or any of the community impact questions. Keep in mind that your review panelists, some of them may be folks who live in New York City and are not familiar with this region or other parts of the state. So you need to be preparing your application, assuming that the person reading it doesn't know anything about your building and may not be familiar with your community. So you're really painting a picture of, not only what activities and work you've done on the building, but what kind of impact your project and building are going to have on the community.
Yeah, and this is another really good opportunity to drive home the point that photographs that you submit with the grant application really help to tell that story. So good, clear photographs that clearly show condition issues or areas of the building that need repair or improvement. Photos of folks using the resource, if that is going to help supplement the community impact section. So using photographs as well as your narrative in the application to tell that story.
This is an important question I want to be sure we answer. If we start on work now, is this work still eligible for reimbursement if you were to receive a grant in 2022?
So the answer to that is no. Only the work that you start after you have final approval from the state and you've completed your grant agreement process with them and they give you the final go ahead to do your work, only that work is eligible. So if you start work now or you already have the work ongoing, it would not be eligible for the grant. Now you could apply, you could still submit the grant for other work, but if you're halfway done replacing your roof right now where you're going to be doing it in the spring, that's not going to work for the grant program because you can't start work before you have that final approval.
And the question that came after that, kind of follows up on that perfectly. So the person saying, so you apply for building repairs, you have to wait to start the project until you've been approved. Yeah, that's correct. So, if you have an urgent need, like a leaking roof, that's something to keep in mind. Let's see. Are there extra points or weight given to projects or buildings in serious distress or with public safety concerns versus versus someone who's applying for more cosmetic repairs?
So not necessarily. Again, in that kind of funding need and where you're going to explain to us about your conditions, the condition of the building, that will play into some of the funding need scoring. However, what it really comes down to is that community impact. So, because this grant isn't necessarily meant because of the timing it takes before you get approved, it's not an emergency repair grant program. So the reality is the higher score things are going to be that community impact and the community need that's there. So you're not necessarily going to get scored higher because your building is in a more deteriorated state. But it could be that you score higher, you know, in how you describe that funding need to us. Then, so you want to work that in.
Yeah, there are different ways to explain different priorities for different buildings. And so not every project is weighted and scored according to the same criteria, but one person's priorities might be more cosmetic compared to another building's more stabilization type priorities, and they both could score equally well. It really depends on the resource, the description, and whether or not you're describing the work that you want to do according to what we would consider proper preservation priorities. Because, for example, if you submit a project that's to replace the windows, but it's very obvious that the roof is leaking and causing water infiltration, that's going to raise some red flags with a grant review panel. So just making sure that your priorities are set appropriately for your project will help create a better scoring application.
Which kind of leads me back to the making sure that you talk to me ahead of time. Not only do you have to get the application from me, so I should probably make that clear too. You do have to get the application directly from me. I add your name and your building address to a list. And in the end, we're only going to accept applications from people who have reached out to me. And this is more to protect applicants. We want to make sure that your application is eligible. If the work you're going to do is something that would be eligible. And that's why when you reach out, we ask for a little brief description with it of what are you going to apply for. That way I can give you, you know, a little information if I think something that you're going to apply for isn't going to be great. It's another reason we're offering site visits and phone calls, is to really look at what are the issues with your building. Because like Fran just said, if you apply to replace your windows because they're drafty, but you have a leaking roof or a wall that's about to collapse, well, you could be applying for one of those, which would make your project a lot more competitive, likely. So we want to help you determine what is that scope of work for your building that's going to make your project most competitive, more likely to be funded. You know, because with the example we just gave with the windows and a leaking roof, if the review panel sees that your roof is destroying the leak in your roof is destroying the inside of your building, or you have a collapsing wall, they're going to say, why would we give money to this person to replace their windows when their building is about to collapse? So, you know, we want to make sure that the scope of work is something that is, you know, kind of being done in the right order. You're tightening up your building first before you start, you know, some of the interior things or something like that. So that's why we highly encourage you to reach out and talk to me about your project ahead of time too.
So we are coming up on an hour and a half, and looks like we've answered all the questions in the chat. Give you just a few seconds. If anyone has last minute questions you want to pop in the chat, we can answer that. Otherwise, you, of course, as Megan said, you do have to reach out to Megan in order to get the application. So that's also a great time to ask any questions. Okay, one more question came in. This person has large wooden windows that need replacement. Can the replacements be wood with a type of insulated glass?
I'm going to say yes. Generally, that would be acceptable under the preservation standards. We'd have to take a look at your specific situation. So one thing to note about window replacement too, or replacement of any historic features, is that they do have to be beyond repair. So if the windows are repairable, we would want you to look into that first. So for things like that, I would definitely recommend reaching out to me and maybe sending a few pictures of your windows, just so that we can kind of help decide whether or not your, you know, replacement of that feature would even be something that could be approved by the state.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. We had really great questions. Thank you for tuning in. We will get this recording up on our website, and we'll send a link to anyone who registered for tonight. And we will do another one in January, but it'll be covering the same material. So no need to tune in twice unless you have more questions. But again, Megan is always available to answer your questions. So please do reach out to her at mclem@landmarksociety.org. And don't forget to put in your subject line, giver, GVRR, and your building address. That really helps her keep track of all of your questions and inquiries. So thank you all. Have a great night. Stay warm out there.
Bye, thank you.